Well, according to my clock, we're just about getting up to 7:30. This, of course, is just 2:30 in Mark Gober's Eastern time in the United States. And we're very, very happy to have him here. And I'm very happy to have all of you here and very much welcome to the Arthur Conan Doyle Center, another Tuesday talk. I sometimes forget to say who's talking next week. So let me tell you now that the Tuesday talk next week is a chap called Lorne Schussel, who has some extremely interesting things to say to us, but no more interesting than the things that Mark has to say to us this evening. Mark is quite remarkable. Like a couple of other people, such as Bernardo Kastrup, he is not an academic, but he is clearly in that intellectual heavyweight division. And he has recently written 3 books, 2 of which are out and 1 of which is just coming out, each of which has the same title. You have no excuse for not remembering them. An End to Upside Down. Upside Down, what is it? Upside Down Thinking. Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, that's right. An End to Upside Down Thinking, an End to Upside Down Living, and an End to Upside Down Liberty, in that order. And I know you all know, you wouldn't be here if you didn't, the sort of thing that upside down thinking, upside down living, or even upside down liberty, which is more political, might consist of, considering this expansion of which Mark is part, and I hope we're a small part, this expansion of people's consciousness towards the importance of consciousness, or towards the importance of mindfulness, or towards the importance of the spiritual, if that's the word you want to use. But anyway, something which is not just materialism. And I always like to hear from people who are academic, but I particularly like to hear from people who have been in the real world and then that have turned to their passion, I suppose, because it has to be, for these other things that we are so interested in. So that is probably everybody in. You know, I'm just filling in time, as people always do, because some people are late. Sorry about that. And I'm going to hand over to Mark now. He's going to talk for about 45 minutes. And if you have anything you want to say, please, as you know, just put it in the chat and I'll pick it up afterwards. I'm really looking forward to this. Mark, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. And I first want to thank Lance and Scott for hosting me. I really appreciate the opportunity. These are my favorite topics, so it's always fun for me to speak to an audience that is receptive to these ideas, and I look forward to engaging with the Q&A afterwards. So as Lance said, I've written 3 books. I also have a podcast series in which I've interviewed dozens of scientists and researchers and experiencers in this general realm of consciousness. It's called Where Is My Mind? And that's available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, all the major players. But as you can see on the screen here, a lot of what I've done has happened within the last few years. And I never expected that I would have done something like this or become interested in these topics about consciousness, the nature of reality, and the spiritual dimension. I was trained very traditionally in terms of my academic background. I went to Princeton University. I studied psychology there, although I started off in the economics department and I didn't like it too much. I thought it was too theoretical and it just wasn't sticking with me. I thought about switching to astrophysics because there was a part of me, I guess, that had big questions. And I had taken some introductory courses in that field and had enough of an interest to meet with the department head and talked about what it would entail to switch majors from the economics department into astrophysics as a late entrant. There was a lot of catching up I would have had to do. I was also on the tennis team at Princeton, which is a Division I program. I was one of the captains of the team my senior year. So that was, it's basically like a job to do that in college, in addition to the academics. So I concluded that I wouldn't make the switch into astrophysics because it would have been too much for me to do it late. I was very grade conscious and I was too worried that it was gonna mess up my life. And I switched to psychology and I blended psychology with economics. I wrote my senior thesis on behavioral economics. So I looked at how people make decisions and certain biases that we have that we don't realize we have necessarily. So I enjoyed that, but in the course of my studies, I wasn't really thinking about consciousness per se. To the extent that it came up, it was sort of assumed that we already understood consciousness in a general sense, and we were just trying to understand the inner workings of the brain, which we'll get into in a bit. So I graduated from Princeton. I went into investment banking in New York, like many of my colleagues. And I started in 2008, in the summer of 2008. This was right during the crisis. And I happened to be in the group called the Financial Institutions Group. I was at UBS, which is a Swiss-based bank, but it's a global bank. I was in the UBS Financial Institutions Group, meaning that our clients were financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, asset managers. So all the companies that were having big trouble. So not only was I at a bank that was having trouble, my clients were having big issues. So imagine companies like AIG, Bank of America, all the companies that were either going under or needed to raise capital, needed to do mergers and acquisitions. That was my world. So long story short is I didn't sleep at all. I mean, investment banking is tough as in a normal situation, but during the financial crisis, it was even more difficult. That was tough. I knew very early on that's not what I wanted to do long term, but I stuck it out. And in 2010, I decided to leave and joined a firm where I spent 10 years, became a partner, but actually left at the end of 2019, early 2020 is when I transitioned out of my firm. And at the firm called Sherpa Technology Group, first I was in Boston, and then most of my years I was in Silicon Valley. We advised tech companies or companies that have technology in really all industries and focused on their intellectual property. So we helped companies think about their patented technologies, and the experience there helped me learn about many different areas, because not only did I have to learn about different business segments, but I had to learn about the law, and I had to learn about the technology underlying the patent or underlying the new business segment. So there was that overlap of business, technology, and law. It kept me very engaged. I really enjoyed it. But in 2016, so now 5 years ago, I was already about 6 years into being with Sherpa. I started to learn about some of these other topics about consciousness. And I should add that at that point in my life, things weren't going so great in many ways. There were a few business deals that I'd spent a lot of time on that didn't go my way, where not for the fault of my own or my colleagues. There were things out of our control that led certain business deals to go in a direction that we didn't like. And then also some things in my personal life weren't going the way that I would have liked. And behind all of that was a sense of meaninglessness in life. So there was this whirlwind, maybe starting in 2014, 2015, but certainly in 2016, where I felt like I didn't know where my life was going in any capacity. And I was listening to podcasts. I wasn't listening to podcasts because I wanted to learn, because I wanted to have a new worldview. It was more just friends would send different podcast episodes, some related to business, some related to health. And I was curious to learn about new things. And it was just kind of a hobby. And I ended up listening to a podcast on alternative health called Extreme Health Radio. It was just one that I came across, and I listened to a bunch of episodes. And one day I listened to the next one that was in the queue from several months before. This was, I think, in August of 2021, August of 2016. And it was a woman who talked about psychic abilities. Her name's Laura Powers, and she went on for probably over an hour talking about her psychic abilities and her ability to heal people with energy. And she spoke about this in a very serious way. Like either she was delusional somehow, or I didn't think she was lying. In the back of my mind, I'm trying to rationalize all these things she's saying. She talked about interacting with non-physical forms of consciousness, interdimensional beings. So this was all over the place. And I had never heard of these things beyond science fiction in a serious way. But I was intrigued that this woman was speaking in what sounded like a serious manner. And the hosts of the podcast were responding in a serious manner too. So at the end of the episode, Laura mentioned her own podcast called Healing Powers. And I said, okay, I'm going to subscribe to that because I'm listening to lots of podcasts. It takes me a long time to drive from San Francisco down to Silicon Valley, where our office is. There's lots of traffic. I'm going to subscribe to this show. And over the next several weeks, I ended up listening to all of her episodes from 2016 back to 2011. Listened to all of them. And what I concluded at that point was something was happening that I wasn't aware of, because many of her guests described experiences that were very similar, but they came from different backgrounds. And I couldn't reason that they were all somehow colluding with each other. I wanted to learn more, because if any part of what they were saying had reality to it, it implied that I had to rethink everything in my life. And that led me to then read books, research more, look at other podcasts. And really, it hasn't ended since then. So my journey started out of curiosity. And I'll say that's where I am currently. It's where I've been the whole way. It has turned into 3 books and a podcast, but that wasn't the intent ever. And if you ask me right now, do I have any more books or podcasts or content in mind? I don't. But the next thing always seems to come about. I really don't know what's next for me. In the last, since leaving my job, I wrote my 2nd book, An End Upside Down Living, and my newest book, An End Upside Down Liberty. I didn't necessarily know that was going to happen when I made these decisions, but those have come out and I don't know what's next. So what I'll be talking about today is primarily the first 2 books, An End Upside Down Thinking and Living. And those concepts relate to the 3rd book, and I'm happy to answer questions about the 3rd book later if you'd like. So I've kind of alluded to a worldview I had that was very nihilistic, where I didn't think there was any meaning in life. And as I got into my research in 2016, I realized that there was a name for the worldview I had. And some would call it scientific materialism, some would call it physicalism. It's essentially the same idea, which is that everything in the universe is fundamentally material. The analogy that I like to use is bringing back to the Big Bang Theory, because that's so popular in science. And the thinking goes under materialism that 13.8 billion years ago or so, there was a Big Bang and it filled the universe with units of matter. We'll call those atoms. So you have a big universe with lots of atoms everywhere. And in this big universe, you end up with atoms interacting with each other. They bump into each other. So the interaction of atoms, that's chemistry. So we have a big universe with lots of random chemical reactions. And chance would tell us that over time, if you have enough random chemical reactions, that you'll end up with a molecule that can replicate itself, like DNA, or something like it. And that would lead to the evolution of biological organisms, like a human being, which develops a brain. And from the brain, we have something called consciousness, which is our sense of experiencing life. That's how I like to think about it, to the extent that we can use words to define consciousness. But it's the sense of experiencing, the sense of awareness that we have. And what materialism says is that consciousness fundamentally comes from material stuff called matter. And more specifically, consciousness comes from a brain. And this paradigm is what I question in everything that I've done so far. This is the fundamental area that I've been looking at, because there are many assumptions built into this paradigm of materialism, which don't hold up upon inspection. Close inspection tells us, wait, there are assumptions in here that don't fully make sense. But I've been shocked to learn in my experience that science can't even explain to us currently how a brain would produce consciousness, even though it's often assumed that the brain does create consciousness because we've advanced in neuroscience. And if I go back to my neuroscience courses and when I studied psychology, this was probably in some of my courses that I don't even remember, that consciousness clearly comes from the brain. We just haven't figured out how it happens yet. And in fact, Science Magazine, a very credible outlet, has listed this issue second in its top 25 questions that remain in all of science. The way they phrase it is, what is the biological basis of consciousness? But really what they're asking is, how is it that a brain produces consciousness? And embedded within that question is the assumption that the brain does produce consciousness. And that's what I am questioning is, well, maybe we haven't solved that question, not what's known as the hard problem of consciousness. Maybe we haven't figured it out because the brain doesn't create it in the first place. And also part of the hard problem of consciousness that's helped me in my understanding of this issue is the world around us and our bodies are apparently material, and yet consciousness is not. What do I mean by that? Like, I can touch my leg right now. It feels physical. But if you ask me to touch my consciousness or touch my mind, touch my awareness, well, I can't. This is the hard problem of consciousness. How is it that something non-material could arise from something material? And of course, I would argue that it doesn't arise from something material. Science, though, tends to assume that it does. And a lot of what I've done, especially in my first book and in my podcast, Where is My Mind? I look at this question of, well, okay, how does the brain create consciousness? If it were to create consciousness, what would that look like? And what's an alternative? Maybe the brain doesn't create it. Maybe the brain acts as a filtering mechanism or an antenna receiver or like a blindfold, meaning there's a much broader reality out there, but our brain actually blocks it. Rather than creates the experience, the brain is the filtering mechanism through which experience is processed through these individual bodies that we have. And there are a number of phenomena which suggest that the brain is somehow limiting our experience. One is the near-death experience, which we'll talk about more later, where a person has a significant reductions in brain functioning. Sometimes their brain is completely off, and yet they have a highly lucid experience. With psychedelics, there's emerging research in that field where reductions in brain functioning are associated with the psychedelic trip. Meaning, again, you have more brain, less consciousness, the reverse. You have less brain and more consciousness, which is the reverse of what you would expect. You would expect in these situations to need more brain activity to produce such an enriched consciousness. And we don't see that. With savant syndrome, that's another one where you have people who have extraordinary mental abilities, sometimes mathematical or musical abilities, incredible memory. And yet when we examine their brain, there is a reduction in functioning or certain parts of the brain are absent or smaller. So that's another paradox. Terminal lucidity is similar, where you have people who, for example, have Alzheimer's disease. They have some kind of brain impairment, but shortly before dying, they snap back into clarity. So you have a normal consciousness with a less than normal brain. Once again, there are many cases of this, less brain, more consciousness, which would support the idea that the brain is not producing consciousness, but in fact is getting in the way of it. And when I interviewed Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, we talked about this concept for my podcast. And he said, we're left with this paradox that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever. Specifically referring to the near-death experience. But that really is a paradox, and that's a problem for materialism. Why is the mind functioning better than ever when the brain isn't functioning? Well, we need to think about a new paradigm, and that's what I've really been exploring. The paradigm that I consider is one that's been discussed throughout many spiritual traditions. The way that I frame it here is, this comes from Dr. Dean Radin, who initially came up with these pyramids. It puts consciousness at the base of the pyramid and says, look, we're not going to throw out physical matter or physics or chemistry or biology. Those things all exist, but they just exist within consciousness. Consciousness is fundamental. Or as Max Planck said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. That's really the paradigm that I've been working with. Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, said, in truth, there is only one mind. And that's the analogy that I like to use, that there is one consciousness of which each of us is a part. And I love Dr. Bernardo Kastrup's analogy, which is to consider consciousness or all of reality as one stream of consciousness, one infinite stream, one mind, so to speak. Each of us is like a whirlpool within that infinite stream of consciousness. So we have the sense of being an individual, but we're fundamentally interconnected. And that's the analogy that I always like to start with. With analogies, it's an analogy. And reality might be much more complex than the way I'm describing it, but it helps us at least wrap our minds around very abstract topics. That's been one of my challenges, is how do we bring something so abstract as consciousness, something I can't even really define for you? And how do we bring that into terms that we can all understand? So if we use Dr. Kastrup's analogy and say that all reality is a stream of consciousness, we're whirlpools within that stream. If some of the water from my whirlpool were to get into your whirlpool, by analogy, that's like some of the water from my whirlpool getting into yours, which is some of my consciousness getting into your consciousness. That would be like a psychic ability. So psychic abilities under this paradigm of reality would be totally possible and predicted. You would expect that psychic abilities are real because we're all in this fluid stream of consciousness. And that's one of the areas that I spend a lot of time on, is looking at psychic phenomena. And the other is the idea that when a whirlpool stops being a whirlpool, for example, the water dissolves into the broader stream. It flows back into the stream. It doesn't leave the stream. So by analogy, it would be as if when our body dies, our consciousness doesn't die. It simply transitions into a new form. So this model of reality, the one mind, one consciousness, would predict that psychic phenomena are real and that when our body dies, consciousness does not die. And the framework that I have applied throughout all of my work is to say, look, if there's any evidence for any phenomena in those areas, we have a very difficult time explaining those phenomena using the materialist perspective that consciousness comes from the brain, that consciousness is somehow stuck in our skull. Whereas if we adopted a different framework of consciousness, we could very easily account for these phenomena. And in my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, there are chapters on each of these phenomena. So there's a chapter on all the evidence for remote viewing and telepathy and precognition, et cetera. And what I say is, look, as a rational human being, I can't shoot down all the evidence. And what we'll do now is briefly go through some of the highlights of that evidence. And again, the reason I felt so comfortable coming out with this, especially the first book and all of my books really, is that it could be the case that some of the phenomena or some of the studies don't pan out in the end once there are more replications. But I can't, as a reasonable person, conclude that that would be the case for every single category. There's simply too much evidence in all these areas. And that's an important caveat, is that I can't claim that every single study is always 100% proper and is 100% bulletproof. But when you combine everything together, it's like a bundle of twigs. Maybe you can break a few of the twigs, but the bundle itself is very sturdy. And that's how I feel about the evidence. So psychic phenomena, some of the water from my whirlpool getting into someone else's, or being able to access something from the stream non-locally because we're all interconnected. That's what this means. Remote viewing is the act of perceiving something from one location that is far away, but not perceiving it with the eyes. So it sounds totally crazy. When I was first learning about this, it didn't really make sense to me. Like, what? My mind could see something from far away, both in space and time? How is that possible? And I was very shocked to learn that the US government has not only run studies on this, but actually practically ran a program for roughly 2 decades. They spent $25 million or so using remote viewing for psychic spying. So this was for national security. And I interviewed Russell Targ for my podcast. He was one of the leaders of this program. But there have been some documents that are declassified now. And they talk about remote viewing, the ability to describe remote areas or conceal data via unknown mental processes is how they explain it. And also remote action, which is influencing something with the mind alone. We'll talk about that later. It's also known as psychokinesis. But the report says here, remote viewing is a real phenomenon. So there you go. That's one piece of evidence right there. That's pretty strong for the US government to be spending millions of dollars on this and spending 2 decades, and they say it's real in their own documents. Additionally, a science panel looked at the evidence and they concluded the implications are revolutionary and the evidence is too impressive to dismiss as mere coincidence. But we just started with remote viewing. We talked about the US government, not to mention any of the other studies that have been done. That's compelling on its own. But some of the other areas, telepathy, which is mind-to-mind communication, precognition, which is knowing or sensing the future before it happens, and psychokinesis, which is mind impacting matter. Many, many studies have been done in all of these areas, and they have achieved what Dr. Dean Radin calls 6 sigma statistical results, meaning that the odds that these things occur due to chance alone is more than 1 billion to 1 against chance. Meaning that in other areas of science, when you have this kind of statistical evidence, the phenomenon is accepted as real. And to quote Dr. Jessica Utz, who was the 2016 president of the American Statistical Association, so someone who knows statistics, she said, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. That's pretty powerful. And that was in her report to Congress, looking at the CIA's remote viewing and other psychic phenomena. So that was her conclusion. And there was I think a very significant study that was published in American Psychologist, which is the official peer-reviewed academic journal of the American Psychological Association. In other words, very mainstream. They published Dr. Etzel Cardenya's meta-analysis of decades of research in all these different areas, and they allowed it to go through. I spoke to Dr. Cardenya about this, and he was pleasantly surprised that they allowed it, but he said they were very tough in the analysis, in the way that they looked at his analysis, but they ultimately allowed it through. So that's very powerful for those who say that the mainstream has never accepted these things. The statistics at least were good enough to make it through a mainstream journal, which for me as someone from the outside, that's very significant. Not to mention all the other academic studies that have been done. There are many, many studies in these areas. So that's just psychic phenomena. Survival of bodily death. We mentioned near-death experiences earlier. To me, this is one of the more powerful areas and has had a big impact on the way that I look at life. There are cases of near-death experiences. Let's say a person's in cardiac arrest, under general anesthesia, some kind of real trauma to the body where their brain, under the conventional view, of science shouldn't be able to produce a complex cognition, and yet it is. And not only is it able to produce something complex, but it's able to produce something accurate. These are known as veridical out-of-body experiences, meaning the person, let's say they're in cardiac arrest, they claim that they hover over their body, they're immersed in unconditional love, they talk about other dimensions, really out there stuff. And yet at the time that all this is happening, they can see things happening from over their body. And they come back, they're resuscitated, and they tell the doctor what happened, they tell family members what happened, and they say, yes, that's true. So here we have something that is, by definition, not a hallucination. It's being validated by other people in the room, and sometimes outside the room. And yet it happens at a time when the brain shouldn't be capable of producing that. So something's going on where the brain seems to be almost, the consciousness seems to be almost independent of brain activity. Very powerful stuff. Communications with the deceased. This refers to mediumship, after-death communications. There are many, many examples of this. I like to refer to the Windbridge Research Center's evidence, which is studies using mediums, so people who claim they can talk to dead people, and they are tested under 5 levels of blinding. So meaning the researcher is on the phone speaking to the alleged medium, gives the alleged medium the first name of the deceased person, and somehow, and there are other controls as well, somehow the medium is able to bring back information that we can't explain by chance alone. So something seems to be going on, and they're working on replications of that. The final category that I've looked at closely is children who remember previous lives. And this has been studied extensively at the University of Virginia. In some cases, the children are able to recall memories that the researchers can validate with historical records. And in some cases, what the children describe, well, in cases where they have a physical defect or something strange about their body that they can't, it's just is atypical, that sometimes correlates with the way the child describes dying in the previous life. So it's almost like something from the past life, something about the trauma is transferred to the biology of the child in this life, which is a pretty crazy idea to think about because that raises many questions about biology in general. And Dr. Ian Stevenson from the University of Virginia in particular has looked at this. This, what you see on your screen here, is an example of a child who talked about being tied up and tortured in a previous life and dying. And what the child said is, look, Grandpa, look at what they did to me, how cruel they were. Something about what happened in the past life apparently has transferred into this life for the child. So something's going on here, clearly, that doesn't align with mainstream materialist science. And so I've had to rationalize this for myself. Someone who is such a conventionally trained thinker, I can't hold the idea that matter is primary anymore because there's too much evidence to the contrary that would fit much more easily with this one mind worldview. And this is the big paradigm shift. This is what I call an end to upside down thinking. And this is what some would say is the biggest meta paradigm shift for humanity in so many ways, because it's not only a shift in how we think about the nature of reality, but it's a shift in how we think about ourselves. It's not just the external world, it's the internal world. What's my identity? If consciousness is fundamental, then my identity is consciousness. And I'm experiencing the physical world or the apparently physical world through a body. The body's then a vessel. That's a huge paradigm shift. I mean, for me, I'm still trying to grapple with that. That it feels like I'm Mark, but I'm not really Mark. I'm something else that's experiencing what it's like to be Mark. And so I constantly have to rethink many of the assumptions I've had and held for much of my life. And when I think about the implications for all this, what does this really mean? Not just for thinking about my own life for us individually, but for science and medicine. Let's just take the children with past lives example. If it's true that there could be a transference of a physical trauma from one life into the next life, that means that something is happening beyond traditional genetics and beyond environmental factors. And traditionally in biology and medicine, researchers will say that our genetics and that our environmental factors are what influence our physical form. And what the researchers at UVA have said is, well, it seems that there's a third factor that's neither genetics nor biology. So if there's a third factor that we're not incorporating in our science, think about what we might be missing. And also we think about a unifying theory of physics or of reality that can combine things like quantum physics and Newtonian physics. There's a lot we don't understand in traditional science that potentially could be reconciled with a new understanding of consciousness. But where I've gone, especially in my second and third books, is thinking about the meaning of our lives and how we orient our consciousness, how we think about our values and our priorities, and even thinking about structuring society, which is mostly my new book, End Upside Down Liberty. How do we rethink all those things? I mean, my old way of looking at life is we are made of matter. We are the product of a random evolutionary process. When we die, there is no consciousness. And we can make up meaning in our life. We can certainly do that, but it's rationalizing because there's no meaning built into the nature of reality itself. There's nothing built into the fabric of this reality that gives us true meaning. It's all random. And that's how I used to think. And I know there are many, many smart people who think that way personally. And that's because of, I think, what our education system teaches us. It sometimes implicitly teaches materialism without saying it's that. And the implication, if you take it out, is that there's no real fundamental meaning. Whereas when I look at what's happening with all this scientific evidence, if there is consciousness beyond the body, consciousness beyond this life, maybe there is real meaning. And when I think about this, my mind goes to the near-death experience, and in particular, the life review phenomenon, which is where a person relives his or her whole life in a flash. And that's a mind-blowing concept because something about time seems to be compressed, where if you could relive your whole life or significant portions of it in a short amount of time, time isn't what we've always thought it to be. And Einstein was getting into some of this with his relativity theory. But in the life review, people often report reliving events through the eyes of the people that they impacted. So there's something about the interconnectivity of things that becomes liberated in this state of consciousness. I mentioned in my podcast, Dannion Brinkley, who I interviewed. He has had 4 near-death experiences. Each time he had a life review. So this is an extraordinary case study because usually people have 1 near-death experience. He was struck by lightning, had open heart surgery twice and brain surgery once. And talked to me about reliving his combat days in Vietnam. So he had to relive what he called was his vicious behavior in combat. He had to relive what it was like to be the dying person through their eyes. And he said he also felt the pain of the children who no longer had a father because he had killed the father in combat. So he felt the indirect effects, even though he said the indirect effects weren't quite as strong. There is something about the rippling effects of our actions that is clear in the near-death experience and in the life review. So that gets to the meaning of life. In a sense, when people come back from their near-death experiences, they often say that what matters is how we treat people. That's fundamentally it. When you're in the life review, how big your house was or what kind of car you drive or what's in your bank account, those were not the things you were judging yourself or observing yourself based upon. You're observing yourself based upon the way that you treat other people and your loving or unloving interactions and how that affects others around you. Sometimes the little things that we consider little from our limited perspective, those are the big things in the life review. I'm often reminded of a case where in a life review, a person mistreated a cashier in a store and then got to experience what it was like to be every other person in line because that cashier was in a worse mood because of that one interaction. So this idea alone is enough to just make us rethink all of our daily lives. Because it does seem that there is some meaning in our lives that's beyond this incarnation. That's one of the big themes. And the notion of karma, that there are consequences to our actions, that becomes completely plausible all of a sudden. So when I zoom out all the way, and this is, I think, why I was so drawn to want to express these ideas through books and podcasts and lectures and everything, is the implications are massive for this, that there are many problems that we can point to in the world. I think the fundamental the fundamental issue is this misunderstanding of reality, because if people really understood the nature of reality, and if what I'm describing is even an approximation that we are interconnected, then a lot of the harmful behaviors that we see in the world would suddenly become irrational. So when we think about coexisting as a species, my personal opinion is that we have to at least have some critical mass of the population come to this understanding. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to coexist if people hold a view of reality that, well, there are no consequences ultimately. When you die, it's over. Survival of the fittest. That leads to destructive behaviors in the end. So the ultimate paradigm shift, from my lens, is this shift in the way we look at reality, the way we look at ourselves, and the way we look at consciousness. So I will pause there. That's an overview, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
You need to unmute.
I do. There I was talking entirely to myself, which is certainly not what Mark has been doing. Do you think we could get rid of the screen and have Mark sort of in the firing line without? Thanks very much. At least we're all there now, which is wonderful. Listen, Mark, that's absolutely great. I mean, that is a summary. I would say that's a summary of the thinking which has, would you say, I'm quite old, has increased from almost zero to really quite a serious proposal in my lifetime. Would you think that'll be about right? It's been building up.
I think it's been building. I realize that now, having done research, it's probably been building even at a time when I wasn't aware of a lot of the science. And
Sure.
Maybe throughout human history, we've been on this evolutionary path collectively.
Yes. And I mean, you know, we could argue it the other way. We could say, well, in the period of religion or more meditational or spiritual things in society and more churches and more gurus and more teachers in the West, and perhaps even still in the East, there are other traditions to whom all this stuff is obvious. So there's always that slight, it seems to you and me, it's excitingly new as a kind of refreshment after 2 centuries of materialism, but maybe to others who have different educations and different, it's not quite so dramatic.
Yeah, well, actually, that has been one of the big selling points for me, is that the ideas here are not new, and that people throughout the ages have come to this very same conclusion, at least at the core, that there is a unified field of consciousness of which we are a part. And maybe there are different beliefs on top of that, but the fundamental aspect of many traditions is consistent.
Yes, I agree with that. Well, following from that, the first question was put into the chat was from Girish Matre. How does abstraction, or that's her word for consciousness, create physical structures? You know, like that's the reverse of the hard problem. Or as in Advaita, is the physical world also an abstraction, an appearance in consciousness?
Yeah, good, very, very good questions. The way I look at the physical world is that it's apparently physical. We interpret it as physical, but if you look under a microscope, atoms are 99.999999% empty space. And in quantum physics, we see the wave-like behavior of particles, where a particle basically exists in a state of probability until it's observed. I'm simplifying. This is the double slit laser experiment in quantum physics. That matter isn't as solid as we interpret it as being. How that comes about, though, what are the mechanics of this abstract consciousness descending into the appearance of matter, so to speak? How that happens, I really don't know. I don't know. I know there are many scientists trying to understand this, and I've looked at lots of complicated theories. I don't know.
Well, okay. Thank you. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to read out a comment from Bob Steck, and I would ask someone to unmute Bob. Scott, are you there? Yes. Could you unmute Bob? I'm just going to read one of his comments and then ask a question from earlier on. His most recent comment is, in my grandmother's lifetime, we went from the Wright brothers to a moon landing. It's not surprising that we've seen consciousness, I think he probably means consciousness studies and so on, advance. I mean, you know, I suppose the implication of Bob's comment here is we're not going to stop. You know, I mean, even if you're right, and I hope you are, that this new view of consciousness takes hold, that's not going to stop. We're going to move through to I sound like someone proposing a sort of science fiction future, but we will move to a better understanding and presumably some better interaction with this better view of consciousness. Because that's what we've always done, I think, is the implication of Bob's point.
Yeah. Well, I think what I've described today is a very high level framework that's an approximation for something that's likely much more complex that any human being could even begin to understand. And one of the things that I, especially in my second book, In End Upside Down Living, studying the awakening journeys of many people in different cultures, there is a theme that arises, which is that we are all evolving in consciousness. And maybe that's what the life review is teaching us, that we're in an evolutionary process and we're here in a body where we kind of have an amnesia, we forget our broader identity and we learn. But in that process of evolution, there isn't a final endpoint. There is a constant sense of discovering and rediscovering and learning. So it's difficult to predict what can be next.
Yes.
Because we don't know what it is. And maybe the nature of consciousness itself is that it's increasing in complexity at all times. So I don't know.
If Mark Gober did know and could tell us what's next, it wouldn't be next. It'd be now. We'd have it. You know, so there is a paradox involved there. So, Bob, would you like to ask a question around that quotation you've got, the quotation from Robert Anton Wilson? What did you mean by putting that there?
Well, you know, I think it explains, and if people haven't read it, it's basically him saying a belief in coincidence is the prevailing superstition of the age of science. And it kind of sums up what Mark has been saying and turning to upside down. He started off by talking about how the physicalism or scientific materialism view starts off with randomness and a bunch of things happening over billions of years until coincidentally some molecules are able to reproduce themselves, and that is the beginning of life. But if you are a proponent of scientific materialism, you have to turn to a belief in coincidence to explain things. We know, of course, that telepathy is impossible. So the fact that you picked up the phone because you were going to call your best friend in Timbuktu, and they were on the phone because they called you, well, that's just a coincidence. You know, it must be, because we know that telepathy is impossible according to scientific materialism. Luckily, science, doesn't necessarily, hold these beliefs per se. Science is a process, and scientists like all of the people that Mark has referenced, and Gary Schwartz in particular, whom I've worked with, are using the tools of science, using scientific processes, using the statistics that Jessica Utz, and others have evaluated, and saying that it's not coincidence. There's something else going on. We may not have a clear idea of what it is, but it's certainly not coincidence. Okay. So the age of science is saying if it's coincidence, and Mark and many, many others, as he has said, are saying, no, it's not coincidence.
Okay, Mark, do you want to say something about that?
Very well said. Thank you. What came up as you were speaking is that in my process of not only interviewing many of the scientists and researchers, that's been very powerful for me to hear their process, but I also joined the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So I've gotten to be on the inside of science that's going on there, and I've gotten to see the rigor that's used. I don't think that's appreciated enough, especially in the mainstream scientific community. This idea, like you said, that everything is random, and there's evidence of telepathy. Well, that can't be true. It must be a faulty study because we know telepathy is impossible based on what physics tells us. Mm-hmm. That kind of logic, I think, underappreciates the level of rigor that's been used, and also the level of scrutiny that the scientists have had to go up against. So at this point, their methods, they know how much they will be criticized for the implications of their studies. So they have to do use bulletproof designs, and they've been criticized over the years so much that they've been able to refine the methodologies.
Yes, of course. Is that okay, Bob? Listen, let's just move on for the moment. I'd like, Scott, if you could unmute Suzanne and Brigitte, please. And I'd like Brigitte to ask her question. I know the one she's going to ask. You can see it in there. It's what she often says. So, Brigitte, you'd like to ask your question? Oh, perhaps she's gone away. Well,
no. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Because my internet connection is very unstable. I hardly see you, so I don't know if you hear me. Lance, could you please do it for me?
Yes. Oh, you want me to do it? Okay. Well, yeah. Brigitte asks, why, if consciousness is primary and universal, should life review experiences only include other people's points of view and not more generally other creatures' perceptions? This is a tricky one for us. We're on safer ground with human beings, Mark, but here we have the animals just waiting to join in, and they have consciousness too, don't they? And many of them have been very badly treated.
Yes. I haven't done research on of what percentage of life reviews include non-human intelligences. But my understanding is that they do appear, that there is a sense of interconnectedness with all life. And there's a quote in my newest book, An End to Upside Down Liberty. I'm trying to remember exactly what the life review experiencer said, but she referenced that point exactly, that she felt interconnection with all forms of life, not just animals, but I think she said trees and just the entire universe.
Sure.
But I guess what comes through most clearly, perhaps, and maybe this is why they're emphasized in the literature, is that harming another human being, the ability to feel that as a human and feel the pain from another human's lens, that seems to really affect people.
Yes, okay. Well, incidentally, before we go on to Suzanne, I think I should just say that I think you've rather made a little hint here about the future of this kind of research, because you could now see in an ecological world, which I hope we're also now entering, you could feel the research in our area going out into other creatures, couldn't you?
Yes, yes. Well, funding is a big part of this. There's a limited funding in this area relative to other areas of science. And Rupert Sheldrake, who I interviewed for my podcast, I also mentioned his research in my first book. He has done studies on psychic abilities in animals.
Sure.
We've shown an effect.
We've watched his films on one of these talks. That's great. Suzanne, what did you want to say?
Well, you know, Mark, all the things that you're presenting is this vast body of work that probably everybody on this call is very plugged into. And so the issue, I mean, we're going to learn more and more as we evolve more and more about why these things are and how these things are, but that they are. And that knowing that what you're talking about is true would change everything. It would get us out of materialist science. It would perhaps create us as a compassionate species instead of a greedy species. So how do we take our this regular world? So I have a proposal. This is a stainless steel baking spoon. It came to my door in my friend's hand. He had just bought it at Bed Bath & Beyond. And we were a small group gathered to learn from him how he did this. And he did it with alacrity. You know, usually you see this kind of spoon, little thing, which, you could probably do that. Well, you couldn't probably do this. And it's so incontrovertible that this cannot be, and yet here it is, that I think, why don't we lead with this in the public when we're dealing with this material? Why isn't there something that, this is front and center and says, okay, we go from here. So that's my proposal. I never hear people emphasizing this the way I would if I were in charge of ruling the world. So.
Well, I think that's absolutely terrific. And I just want to know what Mark thinks about starting with spoon bending.
Well, Suzanne, it's a very good point. I've looked at that phenomenon. I've talked to people that have done it, very credible people that showed me the spoon. There is a stigma associated with spoon bending, particularly because of Uri Geller and Johnny Carson event. And the problem is that if you mention spoon bending, they'll just point to that one thing which the media has propagated on, and they will say, this is fraudulent. We have shown it to be fraudulent. End of story. So
yeah, we'll get the person who can really do it. You know, Uri Geller did fail miserably, but you know, that's an incident where it didn't connect for him. But get somebody who can actually, get my friend who does this. He does this like this. It's so easy for him. He showed us what he did, and we tried, and we kind of wiggled a little, but he was just turning them out. I mean, this is not possible. So if you can do this, that's not possible. All those other things require a lot of understanding and explanation. This doesn't require any, watch somebody do it and you go, oh my God, this is not the world I thought it was.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think what this is starting to bump up against is suppression of the science and suppression of incontrovertible evidence like that. That if, I guess what I'm alluding to is that there might be a desire to ensure that this information is not as widespread, because it's a very empowering worldview for the individual. And for those who seek power, it would make sense to want to squash this kind of thinking. The more I look at this, the more I think that exists, because Suzanne, what you said, there are many people that can do spoon bending. And if we really wanted to prove it, you could have one of the major networks control for all of the things that everyone says, have a scientist get on and say, this is a real spoon. It could be done, but it seems that there's a desire for it not to be done. And I've seen this in other areas in my professional life too, with other inventions, but in the field of consciousness, shooting this down and just putting out hit pieces on people and attacking their character, or sometimes putting out lies. And if people are busy with their daily lives, they don't necessarily have the time to scrutinize when a mainstream outlet puts something out saying this is all fraudulent. And then we have this intellectual hurdle to overcome, which is, how could it be that someone put out a piece saying this is fraudulent?
I mean, yes, that's a terrible road to go down. And for some reason,
it's a different road, but yeah.
Seems to be just that strange other road, though Suzanne's completely right. It would be better if it was front and center. Somehow it just can't be. Scott, could I ask you to unmute Nick Kyle, please? And also possibly David Nathan. I'm going to read David Nathan's question, though I'm not going to read Nick Kyle's. I know he'll do it. It's that David Nathan struck me so strongly. He says that his experience is that at least 6 past lives are not in fact past, but happening concurrently. So yeah, I wonder what David wants to say about that, or you, Mark. What about concurrent lives?
Well, I agree. So the notion of a past life implies linear time. And this is something I have explored in my books, which is that time is probably not the way we conceive it to be. First of all, if we think about the past, it is a thought. It's a thought, a memory is a thought of something in the past. And we infer that that happened in the way that our mind tells us it did, and that there was something in the past. And the same thing goes with the future, that our thoughts about the future are our thoughts in the present moment. So experientially, there's only one thing that we know, which is an ever-present now. That's experientially what we know about time. We don't know anything other than, and also we can do the same exercise with space, that all we actually know is here and now. And we have these interpretations of space and time being different. So it could be that time is not linear. There could be a circularity to it. There could be a simultaneity to it, that there really is just one consciousness in an ever-present now. I'm being reminded of Dr. David Hawkins. I really like his teachings. He compared reality to a hologram, and each point in time is like looking at this one hologram from different lenses. So if you look at it this way, well, that's 5 minutes ago. If you look at it this way, it's the present moment. But it's all just one nowness. And that's how I look at it.
That goes for me as well. I'm not quite sure what I'm saying if I say what you've just said, but it's got to be something like that, hasn't it? But would David Nathan like to say what he means about this? Has he had this experience?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good, excellent. Well, really, here's what I can say about it. Probably, I think 1978, I wrote a poem, and I still have the poem. And it alluded to different existences that I supposedly, if it were in the past, had as past lives. And after I was reading some material by someone probably well known to some of the people on the call, Jane Roberts, which is channeled material from Seth Speaks, in which the whole premise is exactly what you just said, Mark. That in fact we view past, present, and future through a particular lens does not mean that that is what's going on. So I guess what I'm getting to is that the poem I wrote was called "My History Is All Over." My history is written in my face. I think that was the name of the poem. So I started looking at what I look like, not only what I look like, but how I behave in this lifetime, and it doesn't fit how I was brought up. It doesn't fit anything. What I'm interested in, the places I'm interested in, the cultures that I'm drawn to. I'm just going to give you a very quick example. When I was 10, I wanted to do a Siamese temple dance for my parents' day, which was a bit shocking for my teacher and my mom. But it was like I could just do it. I didn't have to think about it. But where could that possibly come from if it didn't come from some other place than I was actually still in that consciousness, even though I appear to be in this consciousness? That's as much as I want to say about it for right now.
Okay, now that's very interesting. It seemed to you that you had other lives, and you, as one of them at least, was influencing you in this one.
And I could tap into it. I didn't have to think about it. It just was like naturally there to be able to do a temple dance in England, in London, at grammar school, at primary school, with no reference other than having seen The King and I film. That was it.
If I can just say, David, I'm glad you said this because I taught in a French university for a while, and in the English department, there were quite a lot of nice French girls. And I occasionally would say, what are you going to do when you grow up? I mean, what are you going to do when you graduate? And one of these girls said to me, I'm going back to India. Now, the French don't have a very strong connection with India as such. Does, but they don't have so many Indians. But she wasn't. She was just a local girl from the southwest of France. Oh, I said, you go to India? Yeah, I go to India a lot. I said, what do you do there? She said, I'm a temple dancer. I said, sort of, Marielle or what her name was. You're a temple. Do you want to see? And she got out her phone and she showed me a film of herself temple dancing with all the other girls. She looked very like all the other girls, very dark. Big eyes, lovely skin, all that kind of thing. She was absolutely terrific. She did it completely naturally. And I said, well, when did you learn to do that? She said, I've always known I was going to do it. I just went out to India and started doing it. I said, well, what about a job? What about your parents? What about normal life? No. She said, I'm going to be a temple dancer. And she did, and she was, and she is. Now, that doesn't have to be past lives, but it's completely weird. I mean, she said she hadn't been taught about it when she was younger or anything like that. So you do wonder.
Well, Mark, I'm kind of interested in what Mark's take is on what has been called reincarnation or past lives. I think I pretty much get what he thinks, but I'm kind of interested if he has anything else to say about reincarnation.
Okay. Mark.
I view it as a paradoxical phenomenon, like so many topics in the spiritual realm, where reincarnation seems to exist at one level, but at another level it doesn't exist, because if there is no time, you couldn't possibly have a past life.
Right.
So I think when we get into these topics, reality is beyond what the human brain is possible of comprehending. That's where I end up with a lot of these subjects, which I know is very unsatisfying to many people, including myself. But I think that's where we have to go, where we just can't understand it at the level of the intellect.
Okay. Well,
thank you.
Thanks very much. And thanks, David. Okay, and I'm going to ask Nick Kyle to say what he wants to say, and perhaps we could unmute Peter Bruin, please, Scott. So, Nick.
A physicist friend of mine said to me some time ago, take 50 years in any branch of mainstream science, and you can easily demonstrate demonstrable progress, verifiable progress. And he said, you've been studying the paranormal for 30 years, Nick. He said, but the subject has been studied by scientists and researchers for well over a century. Can you point to any verifiable progress in knowledge? He said, because it's not just about funding. There has to be a productive area of research to make hypotheses about. And I struggled. And I also struggled when I spoke to a sizable number of paranormal investigators in Ontario, in Canada, where they summed up their knowledge of first-hand progress in their knowledge as opposed to reading from books or the media. And they really struggled to come up with a single statement that they could agree on that was verifiable knowledge in the area of the paranormal. I just wondered what your thoughts are on that, Mark. Maybe you just agree, and your previous comment about difficulties in understanding non-physical intelligence or reality sums it up.
It's an important point. I think that the reason there is a lack of agreement typically stems from a lack of knowledge of the extent of the data. So those who will say that they can't find anything verifiable, it's because they don't know the body of evidence, and that there is continuing evidence, even though it's not as well funded, even though there aren't as many scientists, in peer-reviewed journals where studies are coming out all the time. So, and this is actually one of the difficulties I have, especially with speaking with, let's say, people who have never heard of these topics before, unlike this audience. We're operating from such different bases of evidence, because I've spent all this time looking at it. So for me, certain things would be logical and obvious, but to someone who's never even been exposed to certain topics, it's very difficult to make that leap immediately.
Yes, good point. Okay, thanks. Peter, would you like to say a few things here? And after that, Bob can ask at least one of his remaining questions.
Thanks. Because I clicked on Suzanne's link, thank you, Suzanne. I've moved into a sort of parallel Zoom universe here, so I hope you can see and hear me. Something went wrong. I've been having technical problems all night. Mark, that was a very clear and interesting presentation. Thank you. There seems to be a great coherence of similar non-materialist belief, and the elements remain similar across a large number of the big minds who have spoken to us, and some of whom some of us have read. I'm keen to know what it's like on the front line, and perhaps you were touching on that in your reply to Nick there. I'm keen to know what it's like on the front line of science and philosophy. Are there daggers drawn in the common rooms and fights breaking out? Or are the establishments beginning to accept that a different paradigm needs to be addressed and perhaps applied?
Well, I have not been involved in many of those conversations, so it's hard for me to say from personal experience. So the answer is I don't know. But on some, just from having talked to people and just watched the world, especially over the last few years, I think there's progress, but it's incremental. We haven't seen this huge outburst of people falling in line with this or becoming very interested in it. We've seen an interest in my podcast and my book, so that's one metric that I can use personally. Also, there was a series in Netflix called Surviving Death. I believe that's the name of it. And that's a very popular series. So that to me that's a positive sign that Netflix would put out a series like that.
Yeah, the book that it's based on by Leslie Kane is worth reading, because not all of the series covered some of the better bits of the book, I think. But I do agree with you that it's beginning to creep into the mainstream, but it's kind of not there yet. I'm kind of wondering if you know, or if anyone knows, how long it took Newtonian science to become accepted as Newtonian science by the non-believers in the England of that time and the larger world of that time.
Well, I could tell you that Newton's idea of gravity, which seemed to be a magical force not accounted for by the Bible, was not accepted immediately, but pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And, the Principia was, of course, written in Latin, which put a few people off. It didn't get properly translated for a while, and John Locke had to wait. Even John Locke had to wait for the English translation to come out. I think we're probably talking 20, 30 years. But then we're in a smaller science community with slightly fewer problems at that time. That's perhaps a strange way of putting it, but we're in a very different place now. I mean, how long did it take Einstein to be accepted? No time at all. Who understands Einstein? Nobody. I mean, quantum mechanics, it's all right. This is completely variable. We've had 100 years of quantum mechanics, and even the quantum physicists don't understand it.
Yeah. My best mate is a trenchant materialist. He's also very good doing things that are not easily explainable. Like he won £250,000 on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire because he's a quiz fanatic. But I'd like to find a sort of a handy series of ways of convincing him that his ultra materialist way of looking at the world is not the only way of looking at it. I don't know if that can be easily done.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what I've tried to do in my own way. I mean, I did a podcast because it's a different avenue. Some people like to hear the voices of different researchers, whereas the book it's not as multidimensional. It really depends on who you're dealing with. Some people like to hear about the anomalies that I discussed today. Others, for them, they could say, well, sure, they're anomalies, but we just haven't come to explain them yet. And we don't have to go to a one mind. We can still explain them somehow with materialism. Science just isn't advanced enough. So no matter what evidence is given, there will always be that reversing back to materialism. Depending on the intellectual curiosity level of the individual, Bernardo Kastrup's work can be very impactful because it doesn't rely on anomalies. It's strictly looking at whether or not materialism is more or less parsimonious using Occam's razor than the one mind or a universal consciousness perspective. That one, for someone who's willing to go down the road, I don't know how you can poke holes in it, because, I mean, for those who are not familiar with that idea, and this is going to be, this is a very cursory overview. What Kastrup says ultimately is that it's a simpler solution to say that reality is made of consciousness than matter, because we experience consciousness ourselves, and we can't verify the existence of anything outside of consciousness. By definition, you need a consciousness to experience something. And if you say that matter came first and consciousness evolved later, then you're referring to something that is unverifiable by definition, because no one would have experienced that world before consciousness, because by definition, you said that consciousness didn't exist at that point. So you're making an inference that that universe existed, whereas it's much more parsimonious to say, well, all we know is consciousness, so let's start there. And we can explain reality as well as materialism, but we rely on fewer assumptions.
Thank you.
That's great. By the way, could I just say that Bernardo Kastrup has one book called Meaning in Absurdity, which does go through some evidence, but he's written 12 books, as we know. So.
Yes.
Okay, Bob, which of your many questions would you like to put forward?
Well, I thought I might offer at least a hypothesis to Brigitte's questions of why do people who have near-death experience only see other people or not other creatures. And I think there is evidence in that some mediums will say there's a brown dog, and the person getting the reading says, oh yes, that was my dog when I was young. And so there is an emotional connection, and so other animals do come through. And we know that some mediums also have spiritual guides or advisors that are not human. So there is other creatures out there. And I would say, why do most people not experience this in a near-death experience? Is a near-death experience, until you've had one, is completely unaccountable for. It's a new experience, and you are going to be aware of those things that are most familiar to you. And what are you most familiar with but other people? And I think, in exploring consciousness, we know that intention and attention are two very important variables. And I would suggest that people who can and do enter other states of consciousness use that intention, not just to talk to dead people, for example, or otherworldly beings under the influence of psychedelics, but use the intention and pay attention to perhaps a very slower consciousness of plants and other animals. Don't know if it's true, but it's a hypothesis, and might be worth exploring.
That's very nice. I'm just going to read Peter's comment on that. Again, an answer to Brigitte in a way. It kind of works the other way around in a way, as animals are well known to anticipate death and often seek out and comfort the soon departing. That's true. I mean, maybe they're a bit more advanced than us.
Yeah.
They're feeling a bit sorry for us, eh? Is that what you meant, Peter?
Indeed, yeah. I mean, they often have animals in in care homes and similar places, and it's not always welcome when the animal comes into a room that it doesn't usually go into.
Okay. Well, listen, could we please unmute Maureen Smith if she'd like to say a few words? Meanwhile, I just noticed there's a final comment here, which may be our final comment, I don't know, from John Dye. He says he's just finished an end to upside down thinking and find it really enlightening. What do you think are the best avenues for taking the subject further on scientific research basis to the point where the mainstream academic community couldn't ignore it? We've actually covered that topic, but that's why I don't want John to say it again. But I'm saying it because I think that we all need to think about it a bit. You know, what ways forward would convince? Because in the end, it's not so much as finding the truth, it's convincing other consciousnesses. Consciousness makes everything, you know, what is possible to believe. So I think the business of proselytizing and propagandizing is more important, perhaps, than much, much more evidence. I mean, how many more near-death experiences do we need? I don't know what Mark would have to say about that.
Yeah, I agree. Many of the scientists will agree with you that the evidence that we have right now, if we just stop today, would be sufficient in other areas of science to conclude something's going on here. I think the most I'll give you my conventional answer and then the multidimensional answer, because I don't know which is right. But like from a conventional perspective, I think that if a few influential people in positions of power, whether in the media or the education system, or hopefully both, that could flip things. Because if someone took an interest and said, no, we have to study these things, that could be a domino effect. And there seems to be something holding the system back. And I don't fully understand what it is. I can't see it, but there's something holding it back. But also multidimensionally, we don't know how shifts in consciousness work. We don't know what happens when enough of us on an individual level, whether we're in positions of power or not, when we start to wake up to this, what that does to the overall sea level of consciousness, so to speak. So there could be a shift that we can't envision in a manner that we can't envision. And there needs to be a critical mass that many traditions have talked about.
Yes, absolutely. So does Maureen Smith want to come in on that? Because her question is about the past when things would have been a bit easier for us.
I could combine, Mark and everyone else. I could combine two questions I've asked. This idea that we're somehow making progress towards a greater understanding. I think if we look at the past, just say, for example, things in the Bible, where people saw visions, heard voices, accepted these things, a greater kind of spirituality, and that we have actually are moving further and further away from that rather than towards it. And the second question I asked is, if all of us had agreed here that there might be a new paradigm and we all have a feeling of something coming together, is there any feeling from anyone about why? Or are there any clues in anything that we know now that might explain why?
So, Mark.
Okay, so with regard to the first question, I think there is progress just from what I'm seeing in my own life, even though we are still very far away from where the ancient traditions were, and they probably understood much more than we do societally. We tend to think we're so advanced because we have smartphones, and yet some of these fundamental issues about the nature of reality, we're looking the wrong way. I think there is some kind of an awakening that's happening. Many people that I know in my own life who were never really receptive to these ideas are now starting to question, or at least open up a little bit. And it takes time. I mean, even for me, it took a lot of time, even though it was compressed and it's only been a few years. I spent basically all my time, and still really do, researching this and immersing myself in the topic. And it still didn't happen overnight. So I could imagine for people who just get exposed to these topics because they hear a podcast episode, then they go about their lives and they don't think about it for 6 months. It doesn't always happen immediately. That's my response to your first question. And your second one, can you please remind me, you were asking why, but what was the why in reference to? Oh, Maureen, you're on mute, sorry.
The big why as to why of all of this.
Why of all this?
I'm not meaning that we should know the answer, but I just wondered if as part of our progress or our changing paradigm, with any idea as to the why of it, or does there need to be a why?
Yeah, that's a human question. That maybe was the first thing that I asked myself, and when I talk to people, they want to know why, and I usually say, well, I don't really know. It seems that there is There are a few inferences that I have made based on all this evidence. One is that consciousness is the basis of reality. Another is that the consciousness, which is the basis of reality, is somehow made of unconditional love. Like that is a quality of it. And also that the consciousness is ever evolving. Now, why those things would be true, I don't know. Why would consciousness need to evolve? Some people speculate and say, well, if consciousness is everything, then it needs to create a finite world so that it can have experiences that it couldn't have as an infinite consciousness. So we come here just to have a bunch of experiences as this one consciousness having like infinite number of tentacles, basically, to have these experiences veiled from itself. But then why would it need to do that if it were infinite consciousness? We get in these loops of not understanding. So to me, the why questions are, well, they always end up where you asked, Maureen. If you ask why enough times, you end up there, which is, well, why does any of this exist? Why? And the answer is, I don't know if we can understand it using our intellect.
Great.
Yeah.
Perhaps Scott could unmute Gavin Ritchie while I read two excellent comments from Bob and Nick. Bob quotes Alice in Wonderland, "I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. It's Humpty Dumpty, isn't it?" Or something like that. Yes, we have to believe impossible things, it would appear, from your last answer, Mark, perhaps. Yeah. And Nick Kyle, more cynically, unfortunately, to gain the mass attention that we all want, we might need to monetize non-physical intelligence. I don't know whether that was a serious comment, but somehow money does creep around in the back of this when people talk about funding and so on. Anyway, so Gavin, what are you saying there? You're admiring the bundle of sticks argument, which I have to say is not original to Mark, but he uses it very well.
Yeah, hi Mark. I really enjoyed your first book, and I do like the fact it was an overview of a wide variety of areas, because I think that bundle of sticks is incredibly difficult to dismiss. Have you ever had the experience of debating or confronting or even just discussing with skeptics, where you present the entire bundle the way you do in the book, and have you seen any movement? Because for me, there's a real credulity involved, or a real absolutism required to say that all of that stuff is either coming from deceit or delusion. And it seems to be the only way that you can deny all of it is to say all of it's effectively rubbish.
Yeah.
And well, it's very possible when you acknowledge it in the book that some of it is. All of it? It just seems incredible to me that there wouldn't be some movement or at least some acknowledgement when you're having these personal discussions with skeptics. But what have you found?
Well, I'm thinking about a conversation I had recently with a very prominent doctor. So someone who's a hardcore materialist, has been trained, very well respected, and where there's usually agreement on many areas. This was a representative conversation in terms of just the approach to science and skepticism in general. And where we start to diverge is getting to the evidence itself. Because what I find is that those who are skeptical have very little experience with this evidence, or maybe they've heard of a few studies that they think have been debunked, and that's the end of it for them. So I'll mention a series of studies, and the person will just kind of look at me with a blank stare and say, well, I'm not familiar with that. I would have to spend a lot of time looking at it. So you need someone that's really committed to this. And often people are committed to the reverse. They're committed to preserving their old worldview because it's incredibly disorienting. And I can say this from personal experience, and maybe many of you can too, to switch a worldview like this. I thought I was going crazy. I didn't know who to talk to about this, especially coming from my background. I didn't even know where to begin the conversation. And I think part of the reason I wanted to write this book is so that people around me could understand where I'm coming from. I wanted to give them that opportunity to do it themselves, but also it makes me more comfortable with just the way I look at life. Because many people don't want to, actually you're reminding me of a friend who is a dentist. So again, very traditionally trained. And I presented some of the evidence to him as I was first starting this several years ago. And his response was, you know, Mark, I think you're probably right about a lot of this, but my life's pretty good the way it is. And I don't want to rock the boat. So I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole.
So we don't want paranormal dentists, is what you're saying.
I guess so. But he understood the implication that he would have to rethink so much of his life, and he was concerned about what that would mean for him.
That may be the very blockage which you were asking about earlier. I mean, there is a sort of Hollywood blockage, but look, there was Survival of Death in Netflix, and there's been that thing called Superhuman. And others, you know, and the blockage in academia is slightly weird, but academia has very much closed in on itself in recent years. I find it rather alarming, and I'm sure most of the students don't think the same things that all their teachers think.
Yeah.
Gavin Ritchie's told us that on the question of how long it takes to accept things, poor old Lamarck, who was kicked out of the biological bed by Darwinism, 150 years ago or more, died 170 years ago, is in the science of epigenetics is just making a comeback now, has been in the last 30 years. So, a century for some people and 5 minutes for others and never for quantum mechanics. I think there's no way to predict where the zeitgeist is going to go. Things are always going to be a surprise, I suppose. Okay, well, look, Nick Kyle says that his dental practice is haunted. Maybe hearing the screams and wails of the poor victims of the bad dentist he goes to. I don't know. Okay, and I'm beginning to think that we should wind down now. I think that's been absolutely marvelous. Can I just say that I'm sometimes worried when people start talking about themselves in talks, because it can be an excuse to talk about themselves. But I know it's always valuable, because the only thing in the world that we know for sure is experience, personal experience, our own, and we hope that of others. And I do think that Mark has made a really good case here, because he's one of Jeffrey Kripal's The Flip. Do you know that book? It's about people who've been going one way, and then at some point they've said, I've got to go there, I've got to look at this other stuff. And when they start looking at it, they're very pushed to go back. And that's significant, because there are people who have religious conversions and then 10 years later they decide it's all a load of baloney, but this stuff, very few people get to know our stuff, to call it that, and then say, well, actually, I spent 15 years reading all the stuff, and well, no, it's not for me. I don't believe any of it. That's extremely rare. So I think in this case, Mark has really justified that personal introduction, because it's made it real to me that you're not just an academic who's thought about this stuff. You're someone who's lived it, experienced it, and not gone down the academic route very strongly. And I think that's very valuable. And I really enjoyed your talk. So look, we have various things, hello from Ireland, great talk. You're getting some plaudits in here. And Peter Bruin started telling stories about UFO phenomena discussions in a Greek taverna, which I suppose we really ought to avoid, Peter, if you don't mind. Sorry, I'd be lighthearted.
Not that bad.
No, it certainly isn't. So, unless anybody has the answer to any of the big questions that nobody's been able to answer on this talk, I think I'm going to say good night now. And thank you very much indeed, Mark. I'd like to have you back when you've got the next book out, and you can see the political implications of some of this, which would be very interesting.
Yes. I thank you all for joining. And I thank Lance and Scott for having me. It's always fun for me to speak to an audience that is receptive to the ideas and really understands it and asks such great questions. So thank you all.
That's absolutely great. And thank you everyone for saying thank you so much. And let's say goodbye to Mark with the traditional silent hand clap. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. We look forward to seeing you next week with Lorne Schussel. Thank you very much, Mark. And we'll see everybody again soon. Bye for now.